All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. During his appearance today on the Marshawn and Aaron podcast, Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark talked about the league's recent expansion that saw them add Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado from the Pac 12 conference, which will bring the Big 12 to 16 members for next year. The Big 12 and Yormark have been talking turkey with a litany of schools in recent years, as they've also added BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF to their mix. Now, the Big 12 also had Connecticut and Gonzaga on their radar, but Yormark today explained why that didn't come to fruition. Yormark talked about the dream scenario, which did work out for the Big 12 as they were able to add Arizona, Utah, Arizona State, and Colorado from the Pac 12. And, Yormark, he was talking about things today on the podcast. And according to ESPN.com, he was quoted as saying, I did have conversations with UConn and Gonzaga, and unfortunately, things didn't work out. Only because the dream scenario unfolded for us. So those conversations are no longer. I'm a big admirer of both of these programs. They're fantastic for all the right reasons, but I'm focused on the transition of those four new schools right now. Now, yes, the Big 12's expansion came at the demise of the Pac 12 and American Athletic Conferences. Because when you think about it, Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF all came from the AAC, while BYU was a West Coast Conference member for all of its sports except for football, where it was independent. But the Big 12 getting the Pac 12 schools to join forces with them actually, to me, in my opinion, benefits both Connecticut and Gonzaga. And I say that because Gonzaga is a basketball school, and they have not fielded a Division One football team, excuse me, in close to 80 years. Basketball wise, Gonzaga has been dominant in the West Coast Conference over the last 20 years or so. But to me, in my opinion, I think that the Zags would be a fish out of water in the Big 12. And I say that because your mark, in order for his football survival, has focused on being in as many time zones as possible with his schools, hence UCF, the likes of Cincinnati, of course. You have the Texas schools, Iowa State, Oklahoma State, so forth. You're bringing in Colorado and BYU as well. So, with that said, from a basketball standpoint, Gonzaga, I think, would lose something traveling around the country like that, in my opinion. We've already seen how this scenario worked out for UConn and the American. Granted, they were basically kicked out of the original Big East. And yes, they did win a championship in their initial year in the American and men's basketball. But we saw that rapid decline for this program because UConn was a fish out of water in the American. They were traveling to the South, to the Midwest, and you name it. And, they were no longer getting the recruits basketball wise like they once were in the Big East. And of course, they suffered. Then we saw UConn decide to go back to the Big East for all sports, with the exception of football, obviously, as they're an independent. And yes, UConn is in a rare scenario. And I say that because they are a basketball school that happens to have a Division One football team. Because at the end of the day, when you think about UConn athletics, you think about their men's and women's basketball programs, and you think of what Gino Oriema has done for Connecticut women's basketball over the last 30 years or so. One of the most dominant programs of all time, regardless of the sport. And you think about the UConn basketball legacy on the men's side. Five national championships Connecticut has since 1999, including being the reigning men's basketball champions as we speak. And it's one of those scenarios where, yeah, you know what, the football money might have been there for Connecticut in the Big 12, but at what expense? Now, you look at it right now for the Big 12. To me, in my opinion, obviously bringing on all of these schools, it's all about survival because we've seen it right now at the collegiate level, especially for football. It's dog eat dog. And, conferences are going to try to survive at the expense of other conferences. And, we're seeing that right now. Of course, the Big East fell off and they're non existent in basketball. The Pac 12 is teetering as they're literally trying to hold on right there. And, Brett Yormark, who is a businessman and an opportunist, has taken this opportunity to try to leverage his league as much as possible. And you think about it, the Big 12 has lost some great football brands over the last 10 years. They lost Nebraska to the Big 10. They just lost Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC, hence them going out there and making the push to bring in more schools. And yes, they're bringing in more freight, but I think the Big 12 is going to be more recognizable for being a basketball league as opposed to being a football league. And I say that because you're going to have Arizona, you already have Kansas, you have a very good Baylor program as well, just to name a few. Football wise, you're going to have some good programs for the Big 12, but there's nobody who's going to stand out, if you will, with their national brand. I do think that the Big 12 is going to have the opportunity, football wise, to get their teams to the playoff going forward. But nonetheless, obviously, there's still a huge gap between the Big 12 and the SEC and the Big 10. But I will say this in favor of the Big 12 is that in comparison to the Pac 12 and ACC, the Big 12 is on much sturdier ground because everybody is on the same page. We don't know what's going to happen with the Pac 12. We really don't. They're going to try to survive, they're going to try to piece it together. It's obviously not going to be the same, but let's see if anything can happen. On the same side with the ACC, we already see that everybody's not on the same page. Why? Because you have some of those football schools in that league that are not happy with their payouts in comparison to both the Big Ten and SEC. And like I've talked about it before, if everybody's not on the same page, that is going to be a problem. But nonetheless, with the Big 12, I think it's the right move for them to not look at adding Gonzaga or Connecticut right now. And I think it's the best move for everybody involved. Now, with that said, will the Big 12 come looking for Gonzaga and Connecticut again? At the end of the day, you never say never. For me, Gonzaga basketball is a West Coast thing. I think, in my opinion, what Gonzaga should try to do. And if the Pac 12 is looking to survive, maybe the new Pac 12, which obviously is not going to be as strong as the original Pac 12, would go out there and look to add Gonzaga as a basketball member, bring in all of their programs. Obviously, Gonzaga can't bring anything to the table for the Pac 12 football wise, but I mean, you would still have another footprint within the state of Washington because you would have Gonzaga and Washington State. You'd also have another footprint in the Pacific Northwest along with Oregon State. On top of that, for that to work, obviously you'd have to bring in a San Diego State who has a solid basketball and football program to the Pac 12, along with the Boise, obviously, for football. But nonetheless, I think that should be a possibility if I'm the Pac 12 and I'm looking to survive. For Connecticut, I think it would be less likely just due to the fact that, yes, they have a football team. But I don't think that, with the exception of the Big 12, I don't see, the ACC, if you will, going out there and reaching out to Connecticut just based off of what they do football wise. So I think Connecticut, in my opinion, is on stronger ground in the Big East as long as they decide to be there. Because obviously the basketball money is not the same as the football money. But let's see what happens. But at the end of the day, I think it's best for everybody involved that for the Big 12 to stay at its 16 members, go forward from there. Let Gonzaga figure things out in the West Coast Conference or wherever else they want to go, and let UConn figure it out in the Big East as well. It's one of those where, to me, sometimes you're just adding teams just for the sake of adding teams. And that's what I feel like, in my opinion at least, what bringing in Gonzaga and Connecticut to the Big 12 would have amounted to. So let's see what happens going forward with Yormark in the Big 12. Let's see what happens going forward with Connecticut. And let's see what happens with Gonzaga. Obviously, realignment is still not done. We don't know if Cal and Stanford are still trying to leverage their way into the ACC. We don't know what's going to happen with the Pac-12. So, and obviously for the Pac-12 to survive, it would come at the expense of the likes of the Mountain West, a conference that has been untouched and unharmed so far in all of this realignment. But obviously, at this point, the Pac-12, the remaining members of the Pac-12 are desperate, and if they keep this thing together, you'd have to expect them to try to go out there and lure some teams away from the Mountain West. But nonetheless, the ever changing aspect of college athletics, it's like the old school board at Grand Central Station or Union Station as far as the train arrivals and departures and things of that nature. So we don't know what is going to come. One thing we know for sure, at least for today, is that Connecticut and Gonzaga are not going to the Big 12. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take the time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now, you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So, once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I'm signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.